Good morning. Um, Joe asked me to talk about how public pension plans are funded, what policies are used, and to compare that with the private sector. And he said, you've got 10 minutes. And a lot of you are probably wondering, what am I going to do with those last 8 minutes? But it might take a full 10 to fully explain this. The most significant background here, for my purposes, is a federal pension law called ERISA. It was passed in 1974. It covers basically all aspects of retirement plans in the United States. And as originally conceived, it was going to cover both private sector and public sector plans. In the course of Congress debating it, it was ultimately decided to exempt public sector plans from not all, but most of the substantive ERISA provisions, including the minimum funding requirements. And that's really a fateful decision in a lot of ways. So what did that mean? What difference does that lead to today? In the private sector, basically, when it comes to funding pension plans, we've got ERISA and literally thousands of pages of regulations that dictate how the employer contributions are determined. Very little discretion left to the employer in deciding how much to contribute for a year. In the public sector, that is little discretion in terms of the minimum amount they have to contribute. They have discretion to contribute more. But the minimum required amount is basically fixed by law. In the public sector, because of that exemption, you have funding policies that each public system adopts that decides and settles what those employer contributions are going to be. So what are we talking about? Well, I sort of broke it into two parts. One sort of funding policy drives the measurement of assets and liabilities. You've got all sorts of assumptions about the future. What pay increases are people going to get? When are they going to retire? When are they going to die? You have this probabilistic future cash flow projection for all the payouts you're expecting to happen in the future. But you want to express that future obligation in current dollars. So another key assumption is a rate to discount those future payments and express them in current dollars. You're going to hear this concept more today, discount rate. You have issues about, well, how much of this total liability is accrued? When Joe talks about funded ratios, 100%, it's not 100%. The goal is not to fund 100% of all the benefits the plan will ever pay, but 100% of how much of that liability has been racked up so far, how much has been accrued. Well, how do you decide that? And what's the level of assets that you should use? How should you treat recent unexpected investment returns, big returns and bad returns? Should you recognize them immediately or not? Okay? So once you've settled all those issues, you've got a measure of accrued liability and assets. And then you have two other important policies. You have what period over which am I going to fund that? How many years, for example? And what pattern of payments during that period? Okay, so we're going to talk about, I'm going to talk about really just real quickly the discount rate issue in this comparison and these last two funding policy issues. In the public sector, as we know, the issue of what discount rate to use is settled by the governing board saying, what rate of return do we expect to earn on our invested assets, okay, over the future lives of, say, the current participants? It's now, in California, it's now in the range of 7 to about 7.6%. It's been trending downward. Things are very different in the private sector. there's no role for making guesses or expectations about future returns. A private sector employer must use, whether they're invested 100% in equities or 100% in cash, they're going to basically use the same discount rate. Okay? And it's going to be an historical average of corporate bond yields. Okay? And though it's more complicated than this, but basically in the current world, that's about a 6% discount rate. And because we know what's been happening with these long-term averages, we know that that rate is moving to about 5% over the next 4 years. So we have quite a difference, you can see, in the discount rate between public and private. Okay. So just on a big picture basis, we have a 2 or 2.5% difference in discount rates. What does that mean in terms of the employer funding obligation? Okay. Well, for the employer normal cost, the employer contribution to pay for 1 more year's worth of benefits, I said for a typical non-safety plan, non-PEPRA group, maybe a 40 to 50% increase in the normal cost rate. And that there's some leveraging there by the employee contribution rate, but roughly that would be the result. On the unfunded liability, there's about a 13% increase in the accrued liability, but you have assets here. So if we looked at a plan that had a $100 liability and $75 of assets, before we dropped the discount rate, they had $25 of unfunded. I'm dropping my discount rate. I'm increasing my accrued liability by 13 to $38 of unfunded. That's about a 50% increase. And that's what you're paying on. You're paying on the unfunded liability. So in this example, dropping the discount rate by 1% is increasing my normal cost by sort of kind of 50% and my unfunded liability by about that. And remember, we probably have more like a 2% gap, or will have more like a 2% gap. Okay. The other thing I said I wanted to talk about was how this gap between the assets and the accrued liability gets funded. So as Joe mentioned, in the public sector world in California, we have generally either 20 or 30-year amortization periods, kind of depending on the source. And in the private sector world, 7-year funding, 7-year amortization, regardless of what the source is. In the public sector, it's very common to say, when you're making those amortization payments, instead of paying the same dollar amount each year, well, your payroll will increase in the future. So let's start at let's make your amortization payments lower in the early years. They can increase by that 3 or 4%, we think. Payroll will grow, and there'll be a level percentage of pay. CalPERS and some of the independent systems also say, in the first few years, that's quite a jolt to have to pay off these unfunded liabilities. Let's phase that in. So in the first year, once you begin to pay, just pay 20% of what the amortization payment would otherwise be, and then 40% the next year, et cetera. And there's also a lag because of the timing of valuations, et cetera. Maybe for 2 years after this unfunded liability is created or recognized, you don't make any payments at all. So here's an example just to illustrate the impact of this. You have a city, say, that participates in CalPERS. In 2016, they have an experience loss from investments or whatever, $32 million. This may be a little confusing. We've got 2 scales. On the right scale in blue is the balance. So we start, if you look on the right, we start the blue line at about $32 million. On the left side, we have the actual payments being made on that scale. So as I mentioned, 2 years go by, no payments are made. Then we have the phase-in over the next 4 years. And what's happening during this period is the blue line is increasing, not going down, because the payments that are being made aren't even covering the interest on this unfunded. And in fact, it's not until maybe about year 7 or 8 that the payments are large enough to start covering the interest and paying down that liability. And it's not until 21 years after that the unfunded obligation, that the balance gets back to the original value. So you have negative amortization, 21 years to get back to your starting point, and then these payments still increasing by 3% a year, they become large enough to complete the amortization. The last thing I wanted to mention in terms of a difference, we have a rule in the private sector that says if your funded ratio goes below 60%, measured using the special discount rate, okay, measured using the rate that's 6 to 5%, all benefit accruals must stop. There's collective bargaining agreements that say otherwise, they're overridden. Okay. There's that sort of provision is under ERISA. Government plans are exempt. So we have a situation where benefits continue to accrue regardless of a plan's funded position. And in fact, lots of California plans, public plans, would be below 60% if we measured using the same basis that has to be used for private sector plans. So the upshot is that if these rules, these private sector rules, were to suddenly apply in the public sector, and not proposing that they do, but just for sake of argument, the contribution that governments would have to make to these plans, we're not talking about a 20% increase or a 50% increase. They might triple. Of course, eventually, they would go down compared to the current rules. But in the short term, they would be a lot higher. So that's all I've got. Yeah.
Is that okay? Okay, great. Thanks, Jay. So thanks very much, Joe, for inviting me to come talk. I have a few slides to go through, but I assured Joe that I would be through them in 10 minutes. So the title of my talk is Hidden Debt, Hidden Deficits in State and Local Government Budgets. And one of the reasons I'm so interested in this topic is this idea of whether state and local governments are running balanced budgets, because most of them claim that they are, or at least smoothed over periods of a few years, claim that they are. But the question is, when you have deferred compensation, are they or are they not? So I'm going to start with a really simple example. In fact, I'm dialing things back on complexity here. We've seen a lot of very interesting things in analyses. I just want to start with something really simple. I want to ask the question of what is a balanced budget? So suppose we have a state, and that state collects income taxes. And those income taxes are in this bag of money here. That gets directed to the central government in the capital. And then that money, these two bags are the same size. Think about this as an annual cycle. That same amount of money is going to be deployed on some things that we as citizens like to have our tax dollars spent on. Construction of infrastructure, education, public safety, fire, things like that. Okay, so if this were the end of the story, those two bags are the same size, then this would appear to be a balanced budget. But the question is, what happens when each of these employees here is being promised that they're going to receive a pension when they retire? All right, so I've put some numbers in here. Each one of these employees is dreaming of, or well, they're not dreaming of, they've been contractually promised to receive a pension of a given amount when they retire. Where do these numbers come from? These are numbers you'll see thrown around, if you follow the press. So the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees which is the National Public Employee Union, says that the average pension among their members is $19,000 per year, around $19,000 per year. That includes people who have only worked for maybe a few years and have only vested into a very small pension, as well as people who have worked for a long period of time. Okay, the 43,071, that's what the New York City Teachers Union says that their employees, retirees, are getting on average. If you look at people who had a 25-year career, that number is 68,000. Okay, so that 43,000 is averaged over teachers who have taught different periods of time. Public safety official, that was the most recent cohort from the CalPERS report of what a California Highway Patrol retiree got in the first year, unconditional on career length, and then $100,000 plus per year when they retire. That's a number you've seen thrown around. You know, there are around 21,800 retirees in CalPERS who receive pensions of over $100,000 per year. So if my math is correct, that's outflows of around $2.8 billion per year for those 21,800 people. Okay, so those are some numbers you've seen thrown around. Is the budget balanced? Well, of course, it depends on whether we're setting aside enough money today in order to be able to meet these promises. Because if we're not, tomorrow's generations are going to have to both hire the replacements for these public employees, and they're going to have to pay the pensions of the people who work for us today. So the question is it adequate? So these are data from the Federal Reserve and the Department of Labor. This is just trillions of dollars of assets in retirement plans. Here's what we care about: state and local government defined benefit plans. As of the end of 2016 Q4, they had about $3.9 trillion in these plans. And the question is, are these assets enough to deliver public employees the pensions that they've been promised? Can we say that we've been running balanced budgets and we don't have debt? Well, it turns out, and you're not going to be surprised with this, I believe that we cannot claim that we've been running balanced budgets. In fact, my statement would be that no state or local government that sponsors a defined benefit pension plan has actually run a balanced budget in an economic sense in a very long time, regardless of what their own statements are about their budgets. Let me explain why. I'm going to go to Finance 101. This has some parallels with the video you saw. So I am a finance professor, and we teach this stuff at the business school. So, suppose that you borrow $100,000 due in 2027 with zero interest. All right, so, trying to make this the simplest possible example. You can add different features to this, and the main conclusions are still going to be the same. You then spend $50,000 on a vacation. The money is gone. You invest the remaining $50,000 in a portfolio of stocks and bonds. There they are. A week later, you go to a bank to apply for a mortgage on a house you would like to buy. You've not yet bought the house yet. You've just seen one. This is not an asset of yours. You've just seen this house. It looks really nice. You think, okay, I want to get a loan for this thing. Now, when you go and you you want to borrow money, the bank wants to know your assets and liabilities to calculate your net worth. And so this transaction that you had made, the borrowing of the $100,000, the spending of half of it, and remaining $50,000 in the stocks and bonds, that would be of interest to the bank. They wouldn't care whether you spent the $50,000 on a vacation or on something else, but they would be interested in that transaction. So what is your net worth? It's your assets minus your liabilities. From the loan, you have liabilities of $100,000. From your investment in stocks and bonds, you have assets of $50,000. If you have no other assets, then your net worth is negative $50,000. We teach this stuff at the business school. So this is just basic finance. Okay. In the context of public sector pension funds, people often ask, well, what about these stocks and bonds and private equity and hedge funds and other things that pension systems are investing in? What about your investments? So these are statistics from 1926 to 2016. So this is 90 years of investment history. And this shows what you would have earned on a portfolio of stocks and of bonds, and a 60%, 40% mix of stocks and bonds over that time period. So at the business school, we talk a little bit about the difference between arithmetic average returns, which is the average annual return, and the compound annualized return. Most relevant here is the compound annualized return. If you'd bought $1 of common stocks in 1926 and you held it through 2016 for 90 years, your compound annualized return would have been 10%. Okay, there's no denying of this. If you had bought long-term government bonds, 5.6%. If you had had a 60-40 portfolio and rebalanced the whole way through, you would have had an 8.2% compound annualized return. And that's the basis on which a lot of these expected return assumptions that are used in the actuarial world are coming out. So it's a fact that a diversified portfolio of stocks and bonds has returned 8% per year over the past 90 years. But the question is, does that fact matter in the previous example? So let's suppose that you asked a friend for some advice. And a friend said to you, well, look, let's be conservative and assume that the $50,000 that you didn't spend on the vacation is only going to grow at 7.5% per year. This means your money will more than double every 10 years. It's a simple mathematical fact. 1 plus 7.5% to the 10 equals 2.06, more than double every 10 years. So your $50,000 will be worth 2.06 times 50,000, which is $103,000 in 2027 when your loan is due. You might even invest in some hedge funds and private equity and get even higher returns. Your friend might even know some people. So just ignore this debt that you have, the money that you borrowed, the $100,000, and the fact that you spent half of it. If anyone asks you about your finances, you don't need to mention it. Well, that would be absurd. But that is exactly what governmental accounting does. Because when the government borrows $100,000 from an employee due in 2027, say the promise of 1-year pension to the California Highway Patrol, it spends half of it on current activities like paying for Medicaid. It would otherwise have had to pay the California Highway Patrol person more in compensation. It invests the remaining $50,000 in a pension fund of stocks and bonds and private equity and hedge funds. And it reports a $3,000 net asset, not a $50,000 net liability. It is doing exactly the same thing as the faulty logic that your friend has. So what's the right number to use? Well, the right number to use for disclosure is to use the treasury yield, the yield on a treasury curve. It has nothing to do with what your expected return is or what your historical returns have been on assets. And the reason is that to measure the cost of providing this pension benefit, the only way to do it is to use a number that an insurance company would use if you asked them how much would it cost to provide this. Do you have to fund using that number? No, you don't have to fund using that number. But you can't mark down, for reporting purposes, the value of these liabilities, the costs of doing this. You can't mark that stuff down on the basis of some investment returns that you might or might not earn. There's just no basis in finance for that. So Joe's done a lot of great work with Pension Tracker. I do similar types of calculations. This just shows nationwide, if you look at the total pension liability that is disclosed under GASB 67 standards, which I can talk about more if asked. There was about 5.0, so 4.967 trillion of liabilities disclosed, 3.589 trillion in assets for an unfunded liability of 1.4 trillion. If you use market valuation standards, which values the pension liability using the treasury yield curve and only considers benefits that have been earned up until the present day. So this is this is for you actuaries, this is a termination liability. If you calculate a termination liability using a treasury yield curve, which is, by the way, what the regulations surrounding ERISA had required through the 90s until the early 2000s when companies started to complain that it was too burdensome and too low, you would have a $3.8 trillion unfunded liability and a 48% funding ratio. Okay, I have a report called Hidden Debt, Hidden Deficits, where you can look, I do sort of, calculations by state, Alaska. These are based on tax revenues. So Alaska had a big collapse in tax revenues, so they have many, many years of unfunded liabilities in revenues. Illinois is a kind of classic example. Each of those boxes is 1 year of tax revenues and unfunded liabilities. City of Chicago, unfunded debts to public employees equal 19 years of tax revenue. Okay, so this is just looking outside of California. It is worse elsewhere. I mean, Joe mentioned that. And another way that I like to look at this kind of question in my report is how much did they contribute versus how much would they have had to contribute if they were actually financial economists and were following the financial economic standard, which is no growth in debts, no growth in unfunded liabilities. So say for Illinois, they contributed 12% of all state and local government revenue in Illinois to pension systems, which was a number that a lot of people pointed to and said, see, this isn't that big a deal, it's only 12% of our budget. Well, if you actually were following the financial economic standard, then they would have had to contribute 23% of every dollar collected. This is own revenue, taxes, fees, and everything. Okay, well, that's all I have time for. And my conclusion is that no state or local government that sponsors a DB plan has run a balanced budget in an economic sense in a very long time. Governments are gambling, and hedge funds and private equity on behalf of the citizens. Citizens are only bearing the downside. And in the absence of types of reforms that we have not yet seen, I would say get ready for much higher taxes and much worse public services.
So you've heard a little bit about the sort of the perspective, the public versus private difference. You've heard about the magnitude of the shortfall out there, and Jonathan's going to talk about something else that at least for now is different between the public and the private sector, and that is in California there's something called the California rule. And the California rule suggests that once you are hired as a public employee, you are guaranteed that benefit regardless of what happens to the agency, et cetera. So Jonathan will talk about the California rule. Should be it. Great, thanks.
Good morning, everybody. I'm John Holtzman from Public Law Group. We work a lot on cases that involve vested rights, particularly pension and retiree health in California. So the basic California rule, first of all, let me say a couple of things about that. The term California rule actually does not exist in the case law at all. So if you go looking for the word California rule, at least until recently, you wouldn't find any case that said, here is the California rule. The California Supreme Court, in a series of cases spanning a great many years, ended up developing a rule which is shared by a number of other states, but by no means all states. It's actually a minority of states. And part of the rule, at least, is somewhat unique to California, but it is purportedly based on not just the state constitutional provision protecting contractual rights, but the contract clause of the U.S. Constitution as well. So the first part of the rule, which is not remarkable particularly, is that public employment gives rise to certain obligations which are protected by the contract clause, including salary. So that your salary, the salary earned is protected, not particularly remarkable. The second part is the remarkable part. A public employee's pension constitutes an element of compensation, that's not remarkable either, and a vested contractual right to pension benefits accrues upon the acceptance of employment. That's the critical point. What does that mean? How has that been interpreted? It means that when you start your employment, you obtain a right to the benefits that are then prevailing. That right continues through your entire employment and through your retirement. So the practical impact of this rule is you're looking at the 30 years roughly of employment plus, say, the 30 years of retirement. You're looking at if that rule holds, you're looking at essentially a 60-year window to have any effect on the benefit. Sorry. There you go. Apologize. If you leave me alone with the slide projector, I'm in terrible trouble. Everything I just said is right there on that slide. But thank you. So what is this rule, for better or worse, is not terribly complicated. There's a very well-known article written by a professor named Amy Monahan, who does a very good job of dissecting how this rule came to be. And I have to say that the broad gestalt of that article, which I think is correct, is that the rule didn't come to be based upon any deep consideration of legal policy and certainly not economic policy. Of course, courts aren't especially good at that. But the rule really came about through a series of interpreting different cases. And of course, it came about in a time period, really from the 50s through the 70s and 80s, when pensions were not really center stage in terms of what these concerns that we're talking about today are. So there is an exception to the California rule, and this exception becomes somewhat important. First, even where vested rights exist, public employers may still possess the ability to modify pension benefits for current employees, not for people who are already retired, but for current employees, albeit subject to what the court has described as strict limitations. And in short, those limitations are the following. One, that the change has to bear a material relation to the underlying retirement plan's success. And second, and this is the most critical one for current purposes, it has to be offset by a new comparable advantage. And that provision, that language, if taken literally, obviously undercuts the purpose for which most changes all of us here today would be discussing, which is to say, well, it has to be offset by a comparable advantage, then what's the point? So the cases under comparable advantage have shown, I wouldn't say flexibility, but there's a little bit of flexibility under those cases. They're a little bit all over the map about what constitutes a comparable advantage. There's a couple of cases that say that it has to be to every single individual. So it isn't even in the aggregate. Each individual has to have a comparable advantage, and there are other cases that say otherwise. Why is all of this important? Well, it's important for the obvious reason that it tells you what you're up against in terms of changing this, but it's particularly important because of some recent events. The California Supreme Court has recently granted, or maybe I should say the more important event, the California Court of Appeal has recently decided two cases that if they were to be upheld by the California Supreme Court, would very significantly change the playing field. And I say if because the California Supreme Court has an opportunity to grant a case or not grant a case. They have granted these cases. The California Supreme Court grants cases, unlike the U.S. Supreme Court, with the same number of judges it takes to reverse. So the normal presumption when the court grants a case is that it's out to reverse the case. But let's talk about what the cases are. There are two cases. One is Marin Public Employees, and the other is the CAL FIRE case. The CAL FIRE case is now the lead case in the California Supreme Court. The Marin Public Employees case was decided first, however, and Marin Public Employees dealt with spiking, dealt with various kinds of extra pays and whether they could be taken away. And both these cases, by the way, are occasioned by the changes that occurred to California law under what we call PEPRA, which was the Reform Act, and I'm sure you'll be talking about that some today. So both of these cases directly involve changes that were made under PEPRA, and they challenged those changes. The Marin case is very interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, it comes from what is arguably the most liberal Court of Appeal panel in the state, chaired by Tony Kline. Tony Kline, for those of you who've been around for a very long time may recall, was the appointment secretary for Governor Brown in his first two terms in office. So it's a San Francisco progressive panel. And the case is quite extensive in terms of its discussion of this issue, with the ultimate conclusion being that, if you recall when I said that the cases said that if there's a change in the benefit, that it shall be offset by, there shall be an offsetting benefit. It says that the word shall is wrong, that it should be should. It should have read should, not shall. And so it takes the view, in essence, that, that the offsetting benefit requirement is more of a guideline than it is a strict rule. The CAL FIRE case, which was decided a little bit later and relies in part on the Marin case, deals with airtime and the purchase of airtime. And I think most of you here probably know what that means. It means that you can actually buy time that you didn't serve in a variety of different ways for what amounts to a lot less than it ultimately costs. And it adopted the reasoning of the Marin case and held that pension benefits may be modified prospectively before retirement, so long as a reasonable or substantial pension remains. So these cases are earthquakes in my little world of vesting, but they have been granted by the Cal Supreme Court. Our firm is representing the California League of Cities, which is getting involved in these cases. I think just about everybody else is going to get involved in these cases as well. But I do want to emphasize, so nobody comes away with the wrong impression, that how they come out in the Cal Supreme Court is very much up for grabs. These are pure legal cases, pure legal decisions, which means that the California Supreme Court is not really in any way bound by what the Court of Appeal did. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so let's take a few minutes for questions. We may just skip this break we've got scheduled, but questions from anyone. And if you could identify yourself, and then if you guys can repeat the question just so we can get it for the streaming and the recording. Questions from anyone? Yes.
So earlier, Joe, you mentioned new rules with freelancers in, say, police and fire. It's sort of 80-80 rule, which kind of makes sense. That, and I'm hard to sort of 80% of the time of conflict in the future, we will have 80% of the time.
Right.
You also alluded to the fact that some of our speakers did that private pensions and public pensions are inherently different. Because public pensions do in fact have sort of a built-in insurance. There's private pensions, not pensions. But public pensions do have some kind of insurance in the form of the ability of a municipality to tax. So the professor who gave us the historical data, if I'm God and I come down and tell you that the future economics will be the same as the past, maybe in some randomly scrambled order, why wouldn't I set my pension to something like the ABD rule that Joe alluded to? Which would in fact, because that's a pretty broad thing, give me a fairly high rate of return. If say 80% of the time, I'm going to get 80% of what I need based on the numbers you showed us, it's probably a pretty large number. So would I do that or why wouldn't I do that?
Well, as a policy for funding, you're welcome to do that or not if people see fit. The trouble is that the information is not out there on which to make a sound basis, because already the assumption is built in to mark down the liabilities in an inappropriate way. There's a range of funding decisions that can be made. If part of the solution is to take investment risk, to take market risk and hope that it pays off, then that's acceptable, but not by assuming that it's going to happen with certainty and then marking down the value of liabilities accordingly. You said a couple of things that I thought were relevant. So first of all, in terms of where we are on these probabilities now, I mean, we have sort of standard models in finance based on kind of Black-Scholes, Merton, and things like that. And depending on how you calibrate those things, you'll get a different answer to how likely we are to achieve, say, a 7.5% expected return. But when I play with these models, I find that if you have a 1% risk-free rate, which is what we're looking at today, a market risk premium of around 5%, which is if you survey, CFOs out there, that's what people expect. Then, under those numbers, there's only about a 25% chance of making a 7.5% expected return. So we're nowhere close to 80% likely. We are 25% likely. So that's, even if you want to implement that standard, that's a very big problem. And thirdly, you mentioned, there is this implicit insurance in the power to tax. And I'm not sure I would view that as insurance. I mean, part of the reason for doing these disclosures, I'm a taxpayer. I want to know what exactly I'm on the hook for. So I don't want you to assume that, as a taxpayer, that I'm just going to come up with the money if there's a shortfall. And so I don't see that as insurance in the same way that the PBGC's insurance.
So later today, I'm going to go through some case studies that we've done here that identify pension crowd out, where you see the impact. And it's absolutely clear across the state that there are things that are being squeezed because pension expenditures are increasing. And the question is whether that's appropriate for cities and counties, because some people would say, why are they there? I mean, they need their basic functions they need to perform. So, other questions? Yes. So can you repeat the question, Jonathan?
Sure. So the question is, because these are constitutional rights and they're viewed in the Constitution, what are the opportunities, or what's the chances that the voters could override those constitutional provisions? So the short answer is, first of all, the voters can change the Constitution, and so in that respect, there is an opportunity, I think, to do that. There is a slightly complex question about how such a, because these are constitutional rights and they're contractual, how that plays with the fact that we've already said you had a contractual right to these things and now we're taking that away. But I think the general consensus is that you could modify these opportunities, this rule constitutionally through a ballot measure. Well, you've got Chuck Reed sitting right next to me over here, so I'm feeling a little intimidated. But I think the answer is, and Chuck probably has a better idea because they do polling, they've done polling on this issue, but in general, I think the consensus has been that there is an opportunity here. There remains an opportunity here, but it's tough. It's tough for a couple of reasons. One is the last couple of times that Chuck has tried to come forward with something, the state attorney general has, in the ballot description, described it as eviscerating, I'm paraphrasing, but essentially eviscerating the constitutional rights of public employees, listing nurses and doctors, I forget what group it is, and educators as public employees. So you're up against a strong headwind even getting to the ballot. So that's problematic. My own feeling is that there is an opportunity, there remains an opportunity there. The first opportunity is through the courts at this point because we now have an opening. But I think the second opportunity, if that doesn't work, is through the public. And I think it's an issue that comes and goes based on where we stand economically. And this was huge around 2009, 2010, 2011. Then seemed like the whole fervor for pension change declined to some extent as the public was doing better. I think it's bigger when people are doing less well in their own world. I think you're going to see it again, however, in the next couple of years because the CalPERS rates are rising at such an alarming rate that the crowd out that Joe started talking about earlier is going to be a lot more dramatic. So I think in the next couple of years, if the court route doesn't work, that there is an opportunity on the voter side.
So we can do one more question. Anyone else? Yes.
Paul Gullickson from the press there at Mr. Holtzman. I'm interested in this. Obviously, many people are following the Marin and CAL FIRE cases, but both of them are fairly narrow in the sense that you have Marin that has to do with spiking and CAL FIRE dealing with the airtime, which many cities and counties have dialed back now, and many unions have agreed to take that out of their contracts. Is it possible that the court could end up, even if it moved ahead and upheld this decision, that could be a very narrow ruling that doesn't really help workers?
I think that's a really excellent question, and I think the answer is absolutely. I think there is a high possibility, maybe probability, that the court ends up concluding that it basically agrees with the decision in Marin and CAL FIRE on the sheer basis that the benefit wasn't vested in the first place. which would be a victory, by the way, and would give us some latitude, but doesn't reach the California rule. I think that's a very high possibility, especially because this is a very tough thing for the court at this point to unwind. And so I have to think that it's about the last thing they'd like to take on if they could avoid it. So I think you may be looking at, even in the courts, you know, a 2 to 5 year time frame for getting at that issue. So that's a great question.
Okay, last one.
David Crane, Governor of California. How worried should we be that the judges in California, the state court judges, entitled to pensions?
Well, I have a
If you
radical...
repeat the question, sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. The question is, how worried should we be that the judges who are deciding these cases are subject to exactly the same rules? And historically, the answer is, I think that we should be very worried. I think it has become a little bit less of a problem than it was before for a couple of reasons. One is that you're beginning to get a number of more liberal judges who are seeing this as a matter of principle, as a moral issue, the hollowing out of cities. And so I think that group is a little bit more motivated. That's why it's so interesting that the Marin case is a liberal panel. Second thing is that there are a lot of judges now who are frankly more independently wealthy. They come from big firms and things like that and are probably a little less influenced by it. But the short answer of David's question is obviously that there's a self-interest here.
Great. So we'll conclude this. Thank you. Thank you.